After the War of the Ring had been won and the Shire had been made safe once more, Frodo and Bilbo turned their gaze towards the western horizon and to the distant twilight. These two ring-bearers, each troubled by the memory of the burden that they had carried, set sail from the Grey Havens in the company of Gandalf, Elrond, and Galadriel. This enigmatic farewell leads many readers to naturally ask the question, what became of Frodo once he arrived in the Undying Lands? Though the Lord of the Rings books themselves offer no further glimpse of this journey, the wider books of Tolkien's legendarium provide enough clues for us to form a thoughtful picture of what awaited him in Aman. And delving further into these deeper writings, we're able to also speculate with some certainty as to the fate of Frodo and other beloved characters who shared in that voyage, such as Bilbo and Gandalf. Their journey, of course, began with their voyage out into the wide waters of the sundering seas. And once upon the open waves, they would discover that this was to be no common voyage. For the path that led to the white shores of Aman could not be undertaken at whim or by any common means. The immortals who were permitted to leave Middle-earth and seek Aman, the undying lands of Valinor and Eressëa, an island assigned to the Eldar, set sail and steered due west towards the ancient site of these lands. Note that Tolkien is careful in his wording. The elves did not steer their ships to Aman, but towards the ancient place where Aman had once been. For in the Third Age, the Undying Lands no longer lay within the mortal world. In its beginning, the world known as Arda was flat. And in those days, any skilled mariner would have theoretically been able to sail across the sundering seas and seek Aman. And so, the world remained until the Second Age, at which time the mighty fleet of Numenor, led by Ear, Pharazôn, the Golden, Ion, sailed in force to the shores of the Blessed Realm to make war upon the Valar. Thus Eru, Ilúvatar, the god of Tolkien's universe, was compelled to personally intervene. In order to protect Aman and to prevent any mortal from setting foot there ever again, he reshaped the world itself. The seas were bent, and Arda, once flat, was made round. And the continent of Aman was itself entirely removed from the physical world. From that day onwards, any mortal sailor who ventured far enough to the west would eventually girdle the earth, and the curvature of the world would inevitably turn their course back towards home. And so the question arises, if mortals could no longer reach the Undying Lands, how exactly were the elves still able to make the journey? Tolkien tells us how this voyage appeared to those watching from the shores of Middle-earth. They set sail in ships specially made and hallowed for this voyage. They only set out after sundown, but if any keen-eyed observer from that shore had watched one of these ships, he might have seen that it never became hulled down, but dwindled only by distance until it vanished in the twilight. It followed the straight road to the true west, and not the bent road of the earth's surface. The voyage to Aman demanded a ship which had been specially crafted and hallowed for the purpose. Such vessels were the work of Círdan, the shipwright, Lord of Lindon, and master of the Grey Havens. Though his own personal longing to sail west ran deep within him, the Valar had set upon him a heavy calling, where his craft and his guidance were still required in Middle-earth, and so he resolved that he would not depart until the last vessel set sail upon the straight road. And even in one of Círdan's ships, the voyage could only begin at twilight. For only then could those ships slip free of the mortal world's curvature and follow the path unseen. From the shores of Middle-earth, onlookers would have seen such vessels fade away in the distance. Yet for those aboard the ship, the voyage held a very different aspect. Tolkien offers a glimpse of that experience in the closing pages of The Return of the King, as he describes what Frodo witnessed upon that final voyage. And the ship went out into the high sea and passed on into the west, until at last, on a night of rain, Frodo smelled a sweet fragrance on the air and heard the sound of singing that came over the water. And then it seemed to him that as in his dream in the house of Bombadil, the grey rain curtain turned all to silver glass and was rolled back, and he beheld white shores and beyond them a far green country under a swift sunrise. The sight of these sacred shores had captured the hearts of many mortals. For in the Second Age of the world, from their great island kingdom, set like a jewel amidst the waves of the sea, the Númenóreans gazed ever westward. And on the clearest of days, when the light of the sun lay calm upon the waters, they believed they could glimpse Valinor, where life was unending and no shadow existed. At times when all the air was clear and the sun was in the east, they would look out and describe far off in the west a city white, shining on a distant shore, and a great harbor and a tower. The tower that rose above the white shores was not in fact a tower of Valinor, as the Númenóreans had mistakenly believed. Rather, it was the Tower of Avalon, atop which was kept the Master Stone of the Palantiri. This was the first major landmark that came into view as one neared the Undying Lands, and as they sailed closer still, the lamplit keys of Avalon, on the Isle of Tol Eressëa, would at last come into view. There, the ring-bearers would have certainly been received with honor, and Gandalf would have been welcomed as a returning hero whose long labor had finally reached its rightful end. The splendor of such a is difficult to envision. Yet we have one glimpse from the unfinished tales of Númenor and Middle-earth, which offers a sense of what such a celebration may have been like. For the elves who dwelt upon Eressëa once sailed to Númenor for the wedding of Arindis, and the grace that they brought to that isle gives us some idea of the beauty and wonder that awaited the ring-bearers. Their ship was laden with flowers for the adornment of the feast, so that all that sat there when evening was come were crowned with Elenor and sweet Llywelyn, whose fragrance brings heart's ease. Minstrels they brought also, singers who remembered songs of elves and men in the days of Nargothrond and Gondolin long ago. After their arrival upon the Isle of the Elves, Gandalf would almost certainly have lingered for a time with the hobbits, offering them comfort and guidance as they took their first steps into this new land of peace and healing. Yet his own purpose did not end there. In time, he would continue westward, beyond that isle, to stand before Manwë and the Valar in the heart of Valinor, returning at last to those who sent him forth to Middle-earth. Frodo and Bilbo, however, would remain in Eressëa, for they were not permitted to tread upon the mainland of Aman, for the grace that had been granted to them was more than enough to aid them in their healing. And for the hobbits, simply being allowed to reside upon the Isle of Eressëa offered the promise of restoration. Frodo was sent or allowed to pass over sea to heal him if that could be done before he died. He would have eventually to pass away. No mortal could or can abide forever on earth or within time. So he went both to a purgatory and to a reward for a while, a period of reflection and peace, and a gaining of a truer understanding of his position in littleness and in greatness. Spent still in time amid the natural beauty of Arda, unmarred, the earth unspoiled by evil. Tolkien suggests that the healing which Frodo sought would be discovered through a period of deep reflection, during which time he might gradually gain clarity and understanding, easing the wounds left upon his heart and mind. Tolkien goes on to tell us that this is made possible in Eressëa, because the continent of Aman is untouched by the ancient evil that had poisoned the rest of creation. This is what Tolkien means when he uses the phrase Arda unmarred. For the rest of Arda, including the lands of Middle-earth, had long been marred or infected with an insidious malady born of Morgoth, the original Dark Lord. When the world was yet young, Morgoth had descended into Arda, and in the far north he carved out his first stronghold, Utumno, a subterranean fortress delved in secret beneath the mountains. Out of that dark lair his malice flowed forth like a great shadow upon the world, seeping into its soil and its waters. Now Melkor began the delving and building of a vast fortress deep under earth. Beneath dark mountains where the beams of Iluin were cold and dim, that stronghold was named Utumno, and though the Valar knew not of it as yet, nonetheless the evil of Melkor and the blight of his hatred flowed out thence. And the spring of Arda was marred, green things fell sick and rotted, and rivers were choked with weeds and slime, and fens were made rank and poisonous, the breeding place of flies. And forests grew dark and perilous, the haunts of fear, and beasts became monsters of horn and ivory, and dyed the earth with blood. Morgoth then rose against the Valar, and with the aid of his mighty Omaed, he cast down the two lamps. The violence of that war, and in the ruin that followed the lamps' fall, the original harmony and symmetry of Arda's lands was lost forever. The very shape of the world became a reflection of the great wound it had suffered. Yet the true injury of the marring lay not in shattered mountains or in twisted coastlines, but in the ensuing corruption, for Morgoth poured his own will into the bones of Middle-earth, seeding the very substance of the world with his rebellion. Henceforth, none that dwelled in Middle-earth could escape this stain. His black will would ever manifest itself in their perceptions, their choices, and the course of their deeds. Thus the marring offered dark opportunities to those who wished to follow in the footsteps of Morgoth. They were able to discover in the world the tools needed to advance his designs. Sauron discovered this himself when he used gold to forge the One Ring, a metal that proved disturbingly suited to bearing his malice. Only Aman was shielded from the marring of Arda, for the Valar were able to protect it against the corruption that spread through the rest of the world. For one as deeply wounded as Frodo, one who had carried a fragment of evil crafted from the substance of a tainted world, the Undying Lands offered an escape, a refuge where the weight of his burden could finally become a thing of the past. And beyond its freedom from that ancient evil, Eressëa was also a land of undying beauty. As the hobbits explored its shores and its forests, they would have found wonders unknown in Middle-earth. Even the trees of this land were remarkable, the seedlings of which the Eldar had once gifted to Numenor, to enrich the land of gift with a beauty born of the west. About that place, up the seaward slopes and far into the land, grew the evergreen and fragrant trees that they brought out of the west, and so throve there that the Eldar said that almost it was fair as a haven in Eressëa. They were the greatest delight of Numenor, and they were remembered in many songs long after they had perished forever. The few ever flowered east of the land of gift, Oiler and Lariloki, Nesamelda, Vardariana, Dodaquilas, and Javanamyr, with its globed and scarlet fruits. Flower, leaf, and rind of those trees exuded sweet scents, and all that country was full of blended fragrance. One can picture Frodo and Bilbo walking side by side in such a glade, following quiet pathways beneath the ancient boughs. In such a place, every step would offer relief from the long shadows they had known, inviting them into a sense of serene calmness. And all around, wonders would await their curious eyes. Even the creatures of that realm were unlike any found in the mortal lands that they had left behind. Birds of song unlike any they had ever heard, and countless other animals and insects, which had been shaped by the unmarred thought of the Valar. And I would like to think that the hobbits may have pondered upon how the simple and familiar joys of the Shire could be reflected and yet perfected in this new world. And just as the men of Numenor were once awed when the Eldar brought them gifts from the west, so too would these two weary hobbits find themselves enchanted by the splendor and grace that surrounded them. And thence at times the firstborn still would come sailing to Numenor in oarless boats, as white birds flying from the sunset. And they brought to Numenor many gifts, birds of song, and fragrant flowers, and herbs of great virtue, and a seedling they brought of Celeborn, the white tree that grew in the midst of Eressëa, and that was in its turn a seedling of Galathelion, the tree of Tenna, the image of Telperion. Vana gave to the Eldar in the blessed realm. Nimloth, it was named and flowered in the evening, and the shadows of night it filled with its fragrance. Such remembrance would have stirred both warmth and sorrow within Frodo, for Aragorn, and for so many others who he had left behind in Middle-earth. It was at moments such as this when Bilbo's presence would have been of greatest importance. For a mortal to dwell among immortals would have been a strange and disorienting experience, even in a land so fair. Having one of his own kind beside him brought comfort, steadiness. Bilbo went too, no doubt, as a completion of the plan due to Gandalf himself. Gandalf had a very great affection for Bilbo, from the hobbit's childhood onwards. His companionship was really necessary for Frodo's sake. It is difficult to imagine a hobbit, even one who had been through Frodo's experiences, being really happy, even in an earthly paradise, without a companion of his own kind. And Bilbo was the person that Frodo most loved. Yet Bilbo was advanced in years, even at the time of their passage into the uttermost west. In fact, he was 131 years old when he and Frodo had set sail, and therefore the oldest hobbit ever recorded in the long history of the Shire. This unusually lengthy lifespan was of course due to his long ownership of the ring, which lasted around 60 years. Yet even though he bore an elongated lifespan, by the time that Frodo returned from Mordor, Bilbo had become sleepy and muddled, indicating that he may have only had a few years remaining to him. It should be noted that even after crossing the sea and coming to Aman, the length of his mortal life would have remained unchanged. For their destination may have been known as the Undying Lands. But the land itself did not alter the nature of those who traveled there. Nor could the Valar confer any special grace upon the hobbits in order to extend their lives beyond what was naturally appointed to them. As for Frodo or other mortals, they could only dwell in Aman for a limited time, whether brief or long. The Valar had neither the power nor the right to confer immortality upon them. Their sojourn was a purgatory, but one of peace and healing. And they would eventually pass away, die at their own desire and of free will, two destinations of which the elves knew nothing. It simply means they could choose willingly to accept death at any point before the natural end of their lifespan, who would lie down in peace and release their life freely whilst they were still strong in body and clear in mind before weakness or age could take hold. But as the fear of death crept into the hearts of later kings, they sought to cling desperately to life beyond what was reasonable. And this old custom would not be reinstated until the rule of Aragorn Eliezer. He could have lived on for many years. Aragorn chose to lay himself down and allow his spirit to pass beyond the circles of the world before age dimmed his strength, thus restoring the ancient custom and the dignity of old to the line of kings. With this theme in mind, Tolkien's comments regarding mortals having the ability to choose the moment of their death becomes clearer. Therefore, we can conclude that Bilbo would be likely to pass away long before Frodo wished to relinquish his own life. And with the passing of Bilbo, Frodo would stand alone as the only mortal soul left in Aman. Of course, the company of the elves would hardly be a burden to Frodo. Before leaving Middle-earth, Bilbo had found Rivendell a place of deep contentment for years, and the peace of Eressëa would have only magnified the delight. And Frodo would not be without familiar companionship altogether, for Gandalf would surely spend much time with him. Yet even Gandalf was not truly what he had appeared as in Middle-earth. Behind the kindly figure of the Grey Pilgrim stood Olorine, one of the Aenir, a naturally formless, spiritual being who had taken on the guise of a grey-bearded wizard to aid him in his task in Middle-earth. Now their emissaries were forbidden to reveal themselves in forms of majesty, or to seek to rule the wills of men and elves by open display of power, but coming in shapes weak and humble, were bidden to advise and persuade men and elves to good, and to seek to unite in love and understanding all those whom Sauron, should he come again, would endeavor to dominate and corrupt. It is fascinating to wonder whether Gandalf would continue to wear the shape of a wizard once he set foot again in Aman, or if that humble form would be forever abandoned. The Valar and the Maiar are not bound by flesh. They are spirits of thought and will, who may choose to clothe themselves when it serves their purpose. Yet they may set aside these physical bodies, becoming formless and unseen, or take on a new shape that reflects their new thought. The Valar may walk if they will, unclad, and then even the Eldar cannot clearly perceive them, though they be present. But the shapes wherein the Great Ones array themselves are not at all times like to thee, shapes of the kings and queens of the children of Elvator, for at times they may clothe themselves in their own thought made visible in forms of majesty and dread. Although Gandalf, once he had returned to Aman, could indeed shape his form as he pleased, it seems to me most likely that whenever he visited Frodo, he would have once again taken upon himself his familiar wizardly guise. The face of the wizard was a face that Frodo knew and trusted, and to see Gandalf as he remembered him would have brought him great comfort. But no matter what his appearance conveyed, Gandalf could not offer Frodo the comfort of mortal companionship. Therefore, it is fortunate for Frodo that he and Bilbo were not the last mortals to cross the sea. Gimli, too, was granted the rare grace to sail to Aman with Legolas, being the only dwarf ever to make the crossing. Yet their voyage did not take place until the year 120 of the Fourth Age. Frodo, on the other hand, had sailed west at the very end of the Third Age, when he was 53 years old. An especially long-lived hobbit might live to the age of 130 at most. But Frodo had also borne the ring for 17 years, which would have lengthened his life beyond its natural span. But even if we assume that the ring halted his aging altogether during the time that he possessed it, he could have only lived to be around 150 years old at most. Therefore, we can calculate that Frodo would have certainly passed away before the year 100 of the Fourth Age, some 20 years before Gimli would arrive in Aman. Yet there was one mortal who might have made the long journey to that distant shore within Frodo's lifetime. "Where are you going, master?" cried Sam, though at last he understood what was happening. "To the Havens, Sam," said Frodo. "And I can't come?" "No, Sam, not yet anyway, not further than the Havens. Though you two were a ring-bearer, if only for a little while, your time may come." In the Lord of the Rings books, Tolkien never states outright that Sam will one day sail to Aman. Yet the text certainly leaves us with the suggestion that he is one day destined to follow Frodo across the sea. What strengthens this idea is an omitted piece of text that many readers may never encounter. For Tolkien actually wrote an epilogue to The Lord of the Rings, a final glimpse into the years after the War of the Ring. He later set it aside and chose not to include it after receiving some negative feedback. But the epilogue still stands as a window into Tolkien's thoughts regarding Sam's passage to Aman. In that abandoned ending, Sam speaks with his daughter Eleanor. As they talk of the past, he tells her that he believes he may one day see Frodo again, revealing Tolkien's own sense that Sam was not meant to remain forever in Middle-earth, but would eventually take the road and be reunited with his dearest friend. Before he went, Mr. Frodo said that my time maybe would come. I can wait. I think maybe we haven't said farewell for good, but I can wait. I have learned that much from the elves at any rate. They are not so troubled about time. Sam, at the very least, seems to have suspected that he may well see Frodo again. And the final line of the epilogue strengthens this idea further still, pointing towards the idea that Sam felt an instinctive desire to follow Frodo westward. But before we turn to the quote itself, it helps to grasp a recurring theme in Tolkien's storytelling, known as the sea-longing. Sometimes called the unquiet of Omo, the sea-longing was a powerful, instinctive pull which called the elves to the distant shores of Oman and towards the sea that lay between. Legolas describes this feeling which arose in him after he heard the calling of the gulls at Pelagia. Once the sea-longing is stirred, life in Middle-earth can never again bring a full sense of contentment and peace. Although the unquiet of Ulmo is generally a uniquely elven affliction, Tolkien hints that the calling of the sea may also have touched the heart of Samwise Gamgee. And I felt so glad that I began singing. Mother said, "Quiet, lass, there's ruffians about." And I said, "Let them come, their time will soon be over. Sam's coming back, and you came." "Did," said Sam, "to the most belovedest place in all the world, to my rose in my garden." They went in, and Sam shut the door. But even as he did so, he heard suddenly deep and unstilled the sigh and murmur of the sea upon the shores of Middle-earth. This is the final line of the epilogue, and was clearly meant to land with great significance, guiding the reader to understand that Sam was destined to follow Frodo one day to the Undying Lands. Yet their reunion would have to wait. Sam dwelt in the Shire for many decades. He married Rose, raised 13 children, and served as mayor of Mickledelving. But in the 61st year of the Fourth Age, Sam's beloved Rose passed away at the age of 98. Following her death, Sam's daughter Eleanor recorded the next steps of her bereaved father, and she would maintain that he departed from Bag Inn and journeyed west to the Tower Hills. There he entrusted the Red Book to her keeping, for journeying on to the Grey Havens. And from there, Sam did indeed make his voyage to Aman. And so it came to pass that Samwise Gamgee, steadfast hero of the Shire, crossed the sea at last, and came to the white shores of Elvenhome, where Frodo awaited him beyond the grey veil of the world. There, in the undimmed glory of the realm, where no memory of shadow could dim their joy, the last of the ring-bearers would rekindle the friendship that had once saved Middle-earth. Thank you very much for tuning in to Realms History TV. I would like to take this opportunity to light the beacons and call for aid. If you did enjoy this video, I would ask that you kindly click the like button below. Also, I would be very grateful if you would consider subscribing and clicking on the bell icon.